Well, you're involved in so many writing projects currently that it's hard to narrow down what to speak to you about. But I personally love traveling. And you're writing a series of books that involve some amazing traveling. When you wrote a book about Ranger, the golden retriever, rescue on the Oregon Trail, did you know it would be a series?
I actually pitched that series as a series. And it's interesting, series can start out different ways when it comes to books for children. Sometimes you write a book and you think, wow, I've just written this one book. And then a publisher says, that could be a series. With the Ranger in Time series, that wasn't the case, actually. I had envisioned this as a series because the subject matter just lends itself to it so perfectly. Ranger is this time-traveling golden retriever who's been trained as a search and rescue dog. And, of course, he has magical properties, so he can time travel anywhere in history where people need help, where they can make use of his modern-day search and rescue skills. So if you think about that, it provides sort of infinite possibilities for disasters all through history, places where Ranger could be of help. So that really was envisioned as a series from the beginning.
And this dog manages to help out people in every time period where he travels to?
Yes, that's kind of the premise of the story. He has this magical first aid kit that he dug up from the garden one day, and it begins to hum. And it turns out that that is sort of a time travel magical device. And when he puts the strap over his neck, it transports him through time and space to wherever this historical child needs his help. And then Ranger has various challenges that he faces in whatever the time period is in the setting, whether that's the Oregon Trail or D-Day or the Underground Railroad. And when he's completed sort of the last heroic effort, the first aid kit hums again and he goes home.
Well, one of the books is about escape from the great earthquake in San Francisco in 1906. And just reading the first few chapters, it immediately becomes apparent how educational this experience is going to be. Because not only are you talking about San Francisco and the 1906 great earthquake and the fires that happened, but you're also dealing with a lot of cultural issues. There is the community living in Chinatown in San Francisco. And also in modern day, you have this family who's making preparations to help out refugees. I can imagine the teachers just love these books because they're so educational for the kids.
I do hear a lot from teachers and from classes, and I actually do a lot of school visits and Skype visits with this series because it's a great way to learn history. Obviously, it's a historical fiction series, the fiction being that most dogs don't really time travel, but all the history in the series is heavily researched and accurate, so kids really do get a picture of what life was like in, for example, 1906 San Francisco. You know, we have this huge earthquake and this fire that followed that swept through the city of San Francisco for 3 days, prompting a mass exodus of refugees. But we also have the fact that that happened at a time when there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment in America and laws against Chinese immigrants. And so the Chinese American community in San Francisco sort of had this double disaster on its hands. It had the earthquake and the fires like everybody else, but at the same time, people were enduring the same kind of prejudice and discrimination that was a hallmark of that time period. So it was tougher on that population, I think.
Why is it important for you as an author to educate kids through books?
So we don't make the same mistakes over and over again. And I think we've been talking about that a lot lately, but when kids really read about history and we don't sugarcoat it, you know, we talk about the mistakes that America made, kids are really passionate about justice. And they're really passionate about making sure that doesn't happen again. And they're not afraid to speak up, which I think is fantastic.
Well, Ranger has been to ancient Rome.
Mm-hmm.
He's been to New Orleans during the time of Hurricane Katrina. How do you do your research for these books?
If I possibly can, I like to be in the location, feet on the ground, doing research there. So typically for a Ranger in Time book, I will start my research with piles and piles of reading. I'll go to the Plattsburgh Public Library and the SUNY Plattsburgh Library and just sit with an enormous stack of books and gorge on nonfiction about that time period. Kids nonfiction, adult nonfiction. But there are always questions that I can't answer that way. And so from there I branch out and I'm reading websites and scholarly articles. And I like to take field trips too. For example, the Ancient Rome book, I spent the better part of a week in Italy exploring the ruins of Rome. So you can literally walk through the same gate at the Roman Colosseum that the gladiators walked through when they were getting ready to fight in front of the emperor. And there's something about that perspective and seeing it in real time, being there with a historian to talk about what happened on this spot, that's really inspiring for me as a writer.
So you're traveling to all these places, doing your research. Were there any surprises that came up, something you didn't expect that actually wound up in a book?
There are always surprises. It's interesting, when Scholastic suggested a Hurricane Katrina book, my first reaction was, wow, that's pretty recent and pretty raw, because we all remember that. What I hadn't taken into consideration is my Ranger and Time readers, who are 7 to 10 years old, were not around when Hurricane Katrina happened. So for them, this is historical fiction. And so when I was researching that book, I had the opportunity to talk with people from the Lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans, where the story is set in, which of course was probably the most devastated neighborhood from that hurricane. And one gentleman offered to read an early draft of the manuscript for me. So I sent him the manuscript, and even though I knew how recent and how raw this was, I underestimated the reaction. Because when I sent him the manuscript and then got on the phone with him a little later, I was asking, is it accurate? Is it fair? He's like, yeah, you got the neighborhood right, but that dog has got to get in there and save more people. You don't understand what it was like. People were waiting on roofs. That dog has got to save more people. And it was just heartbreaking for me because of course it's a made-up dog, and that dog can't really go back in time and save more people, but gosh, that's what people in that neighborhood want. They wanted more help than they got. And it's still so hurtful to them to think about it. So that was a really fascinating response, and like I said, just heartbreaking, but really brought home for me the feelings of people in that neighborhood.
That's a beautiful story.
I revised the book and I made Ranger save more people. I figured, I literally went in and I was like, okay, I can't change what happened, but I can make this dog work a little harder for you, because it was important to him.
Well, that's an emotional story. Ranger in Time has some emotional stories, and you don't shy away from tough subject matter in your books for kids. Some of your rougher topics fall outside the Ranger series. What inspired your new book, Breakout?
Well, Breakout was very much inspired by our real-world prison break in northern New York, the prison break and manhunt at Clinton Correctional Facility in the summer of 2015. That, as you know, captivated the region, and I was no exception. I was, anxious, just like everybody else, but also fascinated by this. I used to be a journalist before I was a writer and a teacher, and so journalism, I think, is still very much in my blood. And a friend of mine said, do you miss television news this week? And I was like, I kind of do. So I ended up taking my notebook and going to one of the news conferences in Dannemora a few days after the escape. And then I hung out at Maggie Marketplace across the street from the prison, this pharmacy and market and coffee shop right near Clinton Correctional. And I just talked to people for a few days. And on the second day of just kind of sitting and listening, I had this notion that maybe this could be a book for kids. Which sounds weird, right? Writing a book for kids about a prison break. But I was paying attention to how the prison break affected the community and how people were reacting and how it was bringing out the very best in some people and not the best in others. And that was fascinating to me. And the idea of exploring how such an event affects a community, and in particular the kids in a community, was something I really wanted to explore.
And you've written this book in kind of an unusual way in that it has letters in there, it has text messages, poems. What motivates the format for this book?
So my first draft of Breakout was not written that way. It was written in first person from the point of view of Nora Tucker, the prison superintendent's daughter. And I finished the draft and said, well, I kind of like that. And I sent it to a few friends to read. And some of the feedback that came back when I was sharing with critique partners was really interesting, because they liked Nora's story, but they also really wanted to know more about what other people were thinking in the story, and asked if maybe I wanted to tell this story in multiple voices instead of just from Nora's point of view. And from there, I kind of explored the idea of telling it not just in 2 or 3 voices, but in many voices, as this collection of documents. So now the entire book is a collection of documents that Nora has collected for her community's time capsule project. So there are letters, text messages, poetry, recorded conversations, news articles, morning announcements at school, petitions, a couple of recipes, some photographs, some comic strips that one kid draws. And together, all of those documents come together to tell the story of what happened in this fictional town of Wolf Creek that summer of the prison break.
So do you think you grew as an author writing this book?
I do. Breakout was by far the most challenging book I've written, and there were days where I wanted to throw the whole thing against a wall because it was such a puzzle with all those documents, but I learned a lot writing it, and I appreciate that.
So you're learning a lot writing this book, you're continuing to write other books, but is there something you'd like to do differently now that you have these series that you're doing and these children's chapter books and the picture books? Is there something you'd like to do differently?
I'd like to do a little bit more nonfiction for older readers. I've done some nonfiction picture books, but I'm just about to turn in my first nonfiction for 8 to 12-year-old readers. And that is about invasive Burmese pythons in the South Florida. So that's been exciting to work on. I got to go out tracking pythons this past spring. And I'm just interested in exploring some more ideas from history too, and maybe someday a graphic novel. I'm gonna go back to my Archie comic book days. I always did love comics as a kid, and graphic novels today are just doing so many amazing things. I just love that genre, so I'd like to try that sometime too.
Spotlight is supported by the Glenn and Carol Pearsall Adirondack Foundation, dedicated to improving the quality of life for year-round residents of the Adirondack Park.